The carriage wheel cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and Eleanor Ashworth was thrown forward against the door before she even understood what had happened. Rain hammered the roof, the horses screamed and reared, and the driver shouted words she could not make out over the storm. She gripped the seat, heart pounding, certain the whole carriage would tip into the ditch beside the road. It did not tip. It simply stopped, tilted at a strange angle. One wheel shattered beneath it. Eleanor pushed the door open and stepped down into mud that swallowed her shoes to the ankle. The night was black, except for lightning that lit the world in flashes, and in one of those flashes she saw iron gates ahead, tall and cold, with a crest she did not recognize, carved into the stone pillars beside them. She had been traveling to her aunt's house for the wedding of a cousin she barely remembered, a journey she had agreed to only because her mother insisted family duty came before comfort. Now she stood alone on a strange road, soaked to the skin, with a broken carriage and a driver who was cursing at the horses instead of helping her. "We cannot go further tonight," the driver called out. "The wheel is done for. There is a house beyond those gates. Perhaps they will take pity on us." Eleanor did not want pity from strangers. She wanted dry clothes and a fire, and her own bed, none of which were anywhere near this muddy road. But the storm was not going to soften for her wishes, so she gathered her skirts, already ruined beyond saving, and walked toward the gates. A gatekeeper's lodge stood just inside, a small stone building with a light glowing in one window. Eleanor knocked, and an old man opened the door, squinting at her as if she were a ghost conjured by the storm itself. "Miss, you cannot be out in this," he said. Come in, come in." He was kind enough to send a boy running up to the main house, while Eleanor sat dripping onto his floor, apologizing for the puddle forming beneath her chair. 20 minutes later, a young footman arrived with an umbrella far too small for the rain, and escorted her up a long gravel drive toward a house that seemed to grow larger with every step, until it was less a house and more a small mountain of stone and glass, lit from within by dozens of windows. She was brought through a side door, not the grand entrance, which suited her fine, given the state of her clothing. A housekeeper with a stern face and gentle hands took one look at her and began issuing orders before Eleanor could even explain herself. Towels, a fire in the small parlor. Someone find the girl something dry to wear. It was in that small parlor, wrapped in a borrowed shawl far finer than anything she owned, that Eleanor first saw him. He entered without ceremony, as though checking on a stray cat someone had found in his garden, rather than greeting a guest. He was tall, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from never having to raise his voice to be heard. His dark coat was well cut but not showy, and his expression carried more curiosity than concern. "I am told a carriage broke down at my gates," he said. Eleanor stood, nearly losing the shawl in the process, and caught it just in time. "Yes, I am sorry to intrude. I did not mean to trouble your household." "You have not troubled anyone. Storms are troublesome. People caught in them are simply unlucky." He studied her for a moment longer than politeness required. "You are shivering. Sit down before you fall down." "I am quite all right." "You are quite blue in the lips, which suggests otherwise." Despite herself, Eleanor smiled, and something in his expression shifted, softened, as though he had not expected her to smile at him at all. He introduced himself simply as Alexander, without any of the titles she half suspected belonged to him given the size of the house and the deference of every servant who passed through the room. She gave her name in return, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, the fire crackling between them. "You are not from around here," he said eventually. "No, I was traveling to my aunt's for a wedding. It seems the weather had other plans for me." Weather is rude that way. It never asks permission. He moved to the window, looking out at the rain still lashing the glass. "You will not be traveling anywhere tonight. I will have a room prepared." "That is very generous, but I could not possibly." "You could, and you will, because the alternative is that I send you back out into that storm, and then I would have to live with the guilt of a guest catching her death at my gates. I am rather attached to my peace of mind." There was a dry humor in the way he said it, and Eleanor found herself relaxing in a way she had not expected to, given that she was sitting in a stranger's house, wrapped in his housekeeper's shawl, with no dry clothes to her name. Dinner was served in a smaller dining room than she imagined such a house possessed, just the two of them at a table that could have easily sat 20. Alexander asked questions about her family, her home, the cousin whose wedding she had been meant to attend, and he listened to her answers the way few people ever had, as though what she said actually mattered to him, rather than being something to endure until it was his turn to speak. "You do not ask about my life," he observed partway through the meal. "I assumed a man with a house this size would rather not discuss it. People tend to want distance from what they already have plenty of." He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. "That is either very wise or very convenient of you. Perhaps both. Ask me anything, then. I promise not to bore you with the deed to the estate." She asked him instead about the paintings in the hallway, about a dog she had heard barking somewhere in the house, about whether he preferred summer or winter. Ordinary questions that revealed, slowly, a man who seemed lonelier than his surroundings, suggested he had any right to be. He spoke of his father's passing several years earlier, of a mother who ran the household with more authority than warmth, of days spent managing tenant disputes and grain prices that left little room for anything resembling joy. "It sounds like a great deal of responsibility," Eleanor said. "It is. Responsibility does not leave much space for anything else." He turned his glass slowly on the table. "Tonight is the first evening in a long while that I have simply talked, without an agenda behind it. I did not realize conversation required an agenda. In my world, it usually does." The words hung there, quiet and honest, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, small and unfamiliar, like a door opening onto a room she had not known was there. The storm had not eased by the time dinner ended, so a guest room was prepared for her on the second floor, modest by the house's standards but grander than anything Eleanor had ever slept in. She lay awake long after the household had gone quiet, listening to rain against the window pane, thinking not of her ruined carriage or her missed wedding, but of the way Alexander had looked at her across the table, as though she were the most interesting person he had met in years. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like him did not fall for women like her over a single dinner forced upon them by bad weather. He would forget her by morning, once the roads cleared and she continued on her way. A pleasant memory at best, a footnote in the story of his week. But when morning came, and the sun broke weakly through clouds still heavy with more rain to come, Alexander appeared at breakfast already dressed for the day, and the first thing he said was that the roads were still too muddy for safe travel, and that she was welcome to stay another day, perhaps two, until things dried out. Eleanor knew, even as she agreed, that the roads were not nearly as impassable as he claimed. She knew, too, that she did not particularly want to argue the point. They spent the following 2 days in a strange, comfortable rhythm, walking the gardens when the rain allowed it, sitting by the fire when it did not, talking about everything and nothing with the ease of people who had known each other far longer than a handful of days. Alexander showed her the small library that had been his father's pride, and Eleanor found herself running her fingers along spines of books she recognized, delighted to discover he had actually read most of them, rather than simply collecting them for show. "You are not what I expected," he told her on the second evening, as they stood in the doorway of the library, the last light of day fading behind the tall windows. "What did you expect?" "I am not entirely sure. Someone more concerned with impressing me, perhaps." "You have not once asked about the house, or the land, or anything that might suggest you were calculating your position in it." "Should I have?" "No," he said, and something in his voice made the single word feel like the most important thing he had said all evening. "I am glad you did not." By the third morning, the roads were genuinely passable, and Eleanor knew she could delay no longer without raising questions she did not want to answer, not from her family, and certainly not from herself. She packed the small bag the housekeeper had assembled for her, containing a few items of clothing lent with unusual generosity, and prepared to say her goodbyes. Alexander walked her to the repaired carriage himself, waving off the footman who offered to do it in his place. The morning was bright and clear, birds singing in the hedges as though the storm had never happened, as though the last 3 days had been some strange, pleasant dream rather than reality. "I hope your cousin's wedding was not entirely ruined by your absence," he said, standing beside the carriage door. "I suspect she managed without me." "And your aunt will forgive the delay?" "Eventually. Aunts always do." He smiled at that, but there was something reluctant in it, something that did not want the conversation to end as quickly as the moment demanded it must. "I do not suppose," he said carefully, "that our paths are likely to cross again, given the circumstances that brought us together." "I would not think so. Storms are not known for their reliability." "No," he agreed, They are not. He paused, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might simply let her go. Let the whole strange, wonderful interlude end there at the carriage door, filed away as a pleasant memory, and nothing more. Instead, he reached for her hand, not with any impropriety, simply holding it a moment longer than a farewell required. I find myself hoping the roads near your home occasionally require repair as well. Eleanor laughed, surprised, and something in the sound seemed to please him greatly. That seems like a very inconvenient way to arrange a visit. Inconvenience has served me rather well this week. She climbed into the carriage without quite knowing what to say to that, and as the wheels turned and the house began to shrink behind her, she found herself already wondering, against every practical instinct she possessed, whether she would see him again. She told herself it did not matter either way. She told herself this several times over the course of the journey home, and did not believe herself once. What she could not have known, sitting in that carriage with the fields rolling past and her heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in her chest, was that the storm which broke her wheel had set in motion something far larger than a chance meeting, something that would follow her for years, reshape her life entirely, and eventually reach into a house far grander than the one she had just left, carrying consequences neither she nor the man behind her could yet imagine. A letter arrived for Eleanor 11 days after she returned home, carried by a rider who claimed no knowledge of who had sent him, only that he had been paid well to deliver it and wait for no reply. Her mother eyed the plain envelope with suspicion, but Eleanor took it upstairs before anyone could ask questions she did not yet have answers for. The handwriting inside was neat, controlled, the kind of penmanship that suggested years of careful tutoring. It was from Alexander. He wrote that he hoped her journey home had been uneventful, that her aunt had forgiven the delay, that the weather in his part of the country had turned unseasonably pleasant since her departure, as though the sky itself had been holding its breath waiting for her to leave. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he would be attending a horse fair in a town not far from where she lived, and that if she happened to be free on that particular day, he would consider it a stroke of remarkable luck. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, before folding it carefully, and hiding it in the bottom of a drawer, where her mother would not think to look. She told herself that attending a horse fair was an entirely ordinary thing to do, that there was nothing improper in simply happening to be in the same town on the same day as another person, that coincidence was not courtship. She went anyway. The fair was loud and crowded, full of the smell of hay and leather, and the shouting of men trying to sell horses at prices no sensible buyer would pay. Eleanor wandered through the stalls with her cousin Margaret, who had come along for the outing, and knew nothing of the letter tucked away at home, and it was nearly an hour before she spotted him. Alexander stood near a paddock, examining a chestnut mare with the kind of practiced eye that suggested he knew exactly what he was looking for, and would not be talked into anything less. He looked up, as though he had sensed her presence before seeing her, and the smile that crossed his face was immediate and unguarded, nothing like the careful, measured expressions she imagined he wore for the rest of his world. "What a remarkable coincidence," he said, once he had made his way over, Margaret watching the exchange with poorly concealed curiosity. "I did not expect to see you here." "Nor I you," Eleanor replied, matching his tone exactly, and something passed between them, an understanding that this fiction of chance would serve them both well enough for now. He introduced himself to Margaret with easy charm, and for the rest of the afternoon the 3 of them walked the fair together, though Eleanor noticed that Alexander found reasons, again and again, to fall into step beside her rather than her cousin, to point things out only to her, to ask her opinion on horses he clearly had no intention of buying, simply to hear what she would say. Margaret, to her credit, said nothing about it until they were riding home in the small carriage her father had lent them for the day. Then she turned to Eleanor with an expression somewhere between delight and alarm. "That man was a duke," she said. "Do you know that?" "I heard 2 women talking near the cattle pens. He is the Duke of Ashcombe." Eleanor's stomach turned over slowly, though she tried not to let it show on her face. "I did not know that." "He never told you? You spent 3 days in his house and he never mentioned it?" "We did not discuss titles." Margaret laughed, but there was concern beneath it. "Eleanor, you cannot simply forget to mention you are a duke. He must have meant for you not to know, at least at first. Why would a man like that hide such a thing?" Eleanor did not have an answer, not one she was willing to say aloud, but she understood, turning it over in her mind, that perhaps Alexander had wanted, if only for a few days, to be seen as simply a man rather than a title, a house, a fortune. She understood it because she had felt the same pull toward him, uncomplicated by everything a duke's attention might mean for a merchant's daughter. That understanding did not make the situation any less complicated. Over the following weeks, more letters arrived, each one finding some new excuse to reach her hands without drawing attention from her family. He wrote of small things, a dog that had gotten into the kitchen garden, a tenant's dispute settled more easily than expected, a book he thought she might enjoy that he had sent along under separate cover, wrapped so plainly that her mother assumed it a gift from a school friend rather than a duke. Eleanor wrote back just as often, and in her letters she found herself saying things she had never said to anyone, thoughts about her own quiet dissatisfactions, her wish for a life with more shape to it than the one laid out for her by her parents, her fear that she would marry a man chosen for practicality rather than affection, and spend the rest of her days simply managing a household rather than living a life. Alexander read these confessions and answered them with a gentleness that made her trust him more with every exchange, even as a small, persistent voice in the back of her mind warned her that trusting a duke with her heart was a dangerous business for a woman of her position. They met again, twice more over the following month, each time under some flimsy pretense that satisfied Eleanor's family without revealing the truth of what was happening. Once at a charity event in a neighboring town, where Alexander had somehow arranged to be seated at a table not far from hers, and once at a small gathering hosted by a family friend, who, unbeknownst to Eleanor, had been quietly asked by Alexander to include her name on the guest list. It was at this second meeting, in a garden lit by lanterns strung between trees, that Alexander finally spoke plainly about what had grown between them. "I did not intend for this to happen," he said, as they walked apart from the other guests, far enough that their words would not carry. "I did not go looking for someone to occupy my thoughts the way you have occupied mine since that storm." "Nor did I intend to be occupied," Eleanor said, though there was no real complaint in her voice. "I know what I am, and I know what you are, and I know the distance between those two things is not small. I have thought of little else these past weeks." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the lantern light catching the seriousness in his expression. "I do not know how to close that distance, Eleanor. I only know that I do not wish to stop trying. You have responsibilities," she said quietly. "A house, a name, people who depend on you making sensible choices, and I suspect I am not considered a sensible choice by anyone who matters in your world. You matter to me. I am beginning to think that should count for something. Beginning to think is not the same as believing." He studied her for a long moment, the noise of the party distant behind them, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its careful, measured quality entirely. "Then let me believe it, and let us see where that belief takes us, before either of us decides it is impossible." Eleanor knew, standing there in that lantern-lit garden, that she should have been the sensible one, the one to draw a firm line and insist that whatever this was could go no further, that a merchant's daughter and a duke belonged to different worlds that were never meant to overlap beyond a chance meeting during a storm. She knew all of this with perfect clarity, and she ignored every bit of it, because the alternative meant walking away from something that had made her feel, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely seen. "Then let us see," she said. What followed was a season unlike any Eleanor had known before, filled with secret correspondence and carefully arranged meetings, small moments of stolen time that felt far larger than their brief duration, each one adding another thread to a connection that neither of them seemed able or willing to sever. Alexander found reasons to travel through her town more often than any reasonable business could account for, and Eleanor found herself inventing errands and visits to friends that gave her the freedom to slip away and meet him. Always briefly, always carefully, always with the shadow of discovery hanging just behind them. She met him once beside a river that ran along the edge of a wood, where he had arranged for a simple picnic that his housekeeper had prepared, without asking questions about who it was for. They sat on a blanket spread over the grass, the water moving quietly beside them, and talked for hours about nothing of consequence, the kind of conversation that mattered more for its ease than its content. "Does your family suspect anything?" Alexander asked at one point, watching a heron wade through the shallows on the far bank. "My mother suspects everything and nothing at once. She knows I have been happier lately, and she has not yet worked out why. though I suspect it will not take her long. And when she does work it out? Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. I do not know. I imagine she will be frightened for me. More than angry. She has seen what happens to women who reach above their station and find only heartbreak waiting for them. Is that what you believe will happen? I do not know what will happen. I only know that I would rather have this, whatever it becomes, than spend my life wondering what might have happened if I had turned away from it out of fear. Alexander reached for her hand then, lacing his fingers through hers with a tenderness that made her chest ache in a way she had never experienced before. A sweet, frightening kind of ache that she was beginning to suspect she would never fully recover from, no matter how the story ended. I cannot promise you an easy road, he said. My mother has expectations for me that do not include a merchant's daughter, however remarkable that daughter might be. There are pressures upon men in my position that I cannot simply wave away, because my heart has decided to be inconvenient. I am not asking for promises, Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if that was entirely true. I am only asking for honesty, and for whatever time we are given before the world decides to interfere. Then you shall have both, for as long as I am able to give them. It was a fragile agreement, built on stolen afternoons and careful letters, but for a while it was enough, and Eleanor allowed herself to believe, against every warning whispered by her own good sense, that perhaps love was capable of bridging distances that seemed, on paper, entirely impossible to cross. She did not yet know how quickly that belief would be tested, nor how completely the ground beneath her feet was about to shift, carrying her toward a truth that would arrive not through Alexander's own lips, but through the cruel, casual gossip of people who had no idea how much damage their idle words were about to cause. The news reached Eleanor not from Alexander, but from the mouth of a shopkeeper's wife, a woman named Harriet, who had never met a piece of gossip she did not immediately share with anyone standing near enough to hear it. Eleanor had gone into town for thread and ribbon, an errand so ordinary that she had not thought to prepare herself for anything but the mundane, and it was there, standing at the counter with a length of blue silk in her hands, that she heard the Duke of Ashcomb's name spoken alongside another that was not hers. They say the announcement will come within the month, Harriet was telling another customer, her voice pitched for maximum effect. Lady Cordelia Winslow, a fine match, they say. Her family has land bordering his mother's estate, and everyone knows the old Duchess has wanted that alliance for years. Eleanor's hands went still on the silk. She did not turn around, did not trust her face to remain composed if she did, and simply stood there listening as the two women continued discussing a wedding that had apparently been arranged, or was very near to being arranged, without a single word of it reaching her through any of Alexander's letters. When is the wedding meant to happen? The other customer asked. Autumn, they say, though nothing is official yet. But you know how these things go once the families start talking terms. It is only a matter of paperwork now. Eleanor paid for the silk with hands that trembled slightly, and walked home in a daze that made the familiar streets feel suddenly foreign, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath a life she thought she understood. She told herself there had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding born of idle gossip rather than fact. But the certainty in Harriet's voice had not sounded like speculation. It had sounded like something already decided. She did not write to Alexander that day. She could not trust what her hand would put to paper if she tried, and so she waited, sitting with the news like a stone in her chest, turning it over and over as she searched for some explanation that would make sense of a betrayal she desperately wanted not to be real. 3 days later, a letter arrived from him, written in his familiar hand, full of small pleasantries about the weather and a business matter that had kept him occupied in the city. There was no mention of Lady Cordelia Winslow, no mention of an engagement, official or otherwise. Just warm, easy words that assumed nothing had changed between them, and reading it filled Eleanor with a fury she had not known herself capable of. She wrote back that same evening, her words far more direct than anything she had ever sent him before. I have heard news in town of an engagement between yourself and Lady Cordelia Winslow, she wrote. I would very much appreciate hearing the truth of this matter from you directly, rather than continuing to learn of my own circumstances through the gossip of strangers. His reply came faster than she expected, delivered by the same writer who had brought his very first letter all those months ago, and this time there was no mention of weather or business, only an urgent request that she meet him, as soon as she was able, at the same spot beside the river where they had shared their picnic weeks before. Eleanor considered refusing. Part of her wanted to simply write back that there was nothing left to discuss, that his silence on the matter had already told her everything she needed to know. But a larger part of her, the part still clinging to the hope that there was some explanation that would restore the world to the shape she had believed it held, could not resist the chance to hear him say it to her face, whatever it turned out to be. He was already waiting when she arrived, standing near the water with his hands clasped behind his back, and the moment he turned to face her, she saw something in his expression that told her the gossip had not been wrong. "It is true then," she said, before he could offer any greeting at all. "Eleanor, do not soften it for me. I would rather have the truth plainly than something dressed up to spare my feelings." Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing, as though searching for words that did not exist. "There is an arrangement being discussed between my mother and Lady Cordelia's family. It has been discussed for some time, long before you and I ever met at those gates during the storm. And you did not think to mention this to me. Not once, in all the letters, all the meetings, all the promises you made about believing in whatever this is between us." "I did not want it to be real," he said, and there was genuine anguish in his voice now, the careful composure she had come to associate with him entirely gone. "I have spent months hoping that if I simply refused to acknowledge it, my mother would grow tired of pressing the matter and let it fade away. I was wrong to think silence would make the problem disappear. I understand that now, and I am sorry for the pain my cowardice has caused you. Is it decided then? The wedding?" "Not officially. My mother wishes to announce it by autumn, but nothing has been signed. There is still time." "Time for what, Alexander? Time for you to somehow convince your mother that a merchant's daughter is a suitable match for the Duke of Ashcombe? Time for the entire structure of your world to simply rearrange itself around a woman with no title and no land, because you have decided you prefer her company to a woman your family has chosen." Eleanor's voice had risen without her quite meaning it to, months of careful hope curdling into something sharper. "You told me you would not promise me an easy road, and I accepted that. But I did not agree to be lied to. I did not agree to be kept in ignorance while my future was decided by people who do not even know I exist." "You are right to be angry," Alexander said quietly. "I have no defense for what I have done, only regret. But I meant what I told you in that garden. My feelings for you have not changed, and I do not wish for them to be decided by an arrangement made before we ever met. Feelings are not enough to undo a betrothal, whatever you might wish were true." Eleanor felt tears threatening and refused to let them fall. "Not here, not in front of him. Your mother wants land and alliance. Lady Cordelia's family wants the same. What could I possibly offer that would outweigh any of that in their eyes?" "I do not know," he admitted, and the honesty of it, however painful, was somehow worse than any excuse he might have offered instead. "I only know that I cannot imagine standing at an altar with anyone else, while my heart remains entirely occupied with you." "Then you have a decision to make, Your Grace, and I suspect it is not one I can make for you, nor one I should be asked to wait around hoping you will eventually reach." She used his title deliberately, watching it land like a blow, a reminder of exactly the distance she had tried so hard to forget existed between them. "I will not be a secret kept in the corners of your life while you marry someone else in public. I deserve better than that, whatever my station happens to be. I am not asking you to be a secret." "Then what are you asking me to be?" "Because right now, that is precisely what I am, and I do not know how much longer I can bear it." Alexander crossed the distance between them and took her hands in his, and though she wanted to pull away, some part of her could not quite bring herself to do it. "Give me time," he said. "Let me speak with my mother. Let me find some way through this that does not require either of us to lose the other. I am not willing to simply surrender you to convention without a fight." "And if you cannot find a way through it? If your mother refuses? If the arrangement with Lady Cordelia's family proceeds regardless of what you want?" He did not answer immediately, and his silence told her more than words could have. "I do not know," he finally said, "but I would rather try and fail than never try at all." Eleanor left the riverbank that day without any promises exchanged, only a fragile agreement that she would give him a season to attempt whatever negotiation he believed possible with his mother, though privately she held little hope that anything would change. She had seen enough of the world to understand how rarely love was permitted to overrule land and lineage, however sincerely it burned in the hearts of the people caught within its pull. The weeks that followed were quieter than before, fewer letters, fewer stolen meetings, as Alexander occupied himself with conversations at home that Eleanor was not privy to, and could only imagine, each one presumably an attempt to shift his mother's plans in a direction that would allow for something other than heartbreak. She threw herself into her own life during this time, helping her mother with the household, attending to her father's small shop, trying to convince herself that whatever happened with Alexander, her life would continue regardless, that she was not so foolish as to have staked her entire happiness on the whims of a man whose world she had only briefly been permitted to glimpse. But every evening, when the house grew quiet and she retired to her room, she found herself thinking of him anyway, of the way he had looked at her that first night by the fire, of the warmth in his voice reading her letters aloud in her mind, of the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether the next letter she received would carry hope or the final, unavoidable end of everything they had built together. When his next letter finally arrived, nearly a month after their conversation at the river, Eleanor opened it with hands that shook, bracing herself for whatever news it carried, unable to guess which direction fate had chosen to push them, and entirely unprepared for what she would find written inside. The letter was shorter than any he had sent before, as though the words inside had cost him something to write, and he could not bear to linger over them longer than necessary. His mother would not be moved. She had reminded him, in terms he described only as unflinching, of every duty owed to the estate, to the tenants whose livelihoods depended on stability, to a family name that had never once, in 3 generations, married outside its own narrow circle of acceptable houses. Lady Cordelia's family had already begun preparing for an autumn announcement, and to withdraw now would not simply embarrass one family, but 2, along with any hope of the political alliances both households had been quietly building for years. He wrote that he had tried every argument he could construct, had even gone so far as to suggest that his own happiness might be worth something in the calculation, only to be told, plainly and without cruelty but without softness either, that dukes did not have the luxury of happiness as an independent consideration. Duty came first. It always had, in every generation of his family, and his mother saw no reason his should be the exception. "I am to be married in autumn," the letter read. "I have not the power to change this, though I have tried harder than you may believe. I do not ask you to forgive me for failing, only to understand that the failure was not born of a lack of trying, nor a lack of feeling for you that remains as true today as it was the night I first pulled you from the rain." Eleanor read the letter twice, then set it down on her bed and sat very still for a long while, feeling something inside her go quiet and cold, the last flicker of hope she had been nursing, finally extinguished by ink and paper. She had known, of course, that this was the most likely outcome from the very beginning. She had told herself as much, over and over, every time hope tried to convince her otherwise. Knowing it and living it, she discovered, were entirely different experiences. She did not reply for 2 days, uncertain what there was left to say that would not simply reopen a wound that needed, for her own sake, to begin closing. But on the 3rd day, another letter arrived, and this one was different from anything he had written before, shorter still, and far more direct. "I know I have no right to ask anything more of you," it read, "but I find I cannot let this end in silence and paper alone. Meet me once more, before the announcement is made, before everything changes beyond recall. I ask for one evening, nothing more, so that whatever comes after, we may at least have chosen how to say goodbye, rather than allowing distance and duty to decide it for us." Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time before deciding. Every sensible instinct told her that meeting him again would only deepen a wound that desperately needed space to heal, that nothing good could come from lingering in the company of a man about to marry someone else. But there was another voice inside her, quieter but no less insistent, that argued she owed it to herself, and perhaps to him as well, to close this chapter properly, rather than allowing it to simply fade into the kind of silence that leaves questions unanswered forever. She agreed to meet him, choosing a small cottage on the edge of his estate that had once belonged to a groundskeeper and now stood empty, far enough from the main house to avoid prying eyes, close enough that Alexander could slip away for an evening, without raising suspicion among a household already occupied with wedding preparations. She told her family she was staying the night with a friend, a lie that tasted bitter in her mouth but felt, in that moment, unavoidable given the weight of what she intended to do. The cottage was small and simply furnished, but someone, presumably Alexander himself, had taken the trouble to light candles throughout the front room and lay a fire in the small hearth, so that when Eleanor arrived, the space glowed warm and golden against the deepening evening outside. He was waiting for her, standing near the fire, and when she entered, he looked at her the way he had looked at her that very first night, as though she were the only interesting thing in a world otherwise full of obligation and expectation. "You came," he said. "I told myself a dozen reasons not to. And yet here you are. Here I am." She crossed the small room and stood before him, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire and the warmth of him besides. "This is not a happy occasion, whatever candles you have lit for it." "No," he agreed softly. "But it is an honest one, and I find I have grown to value honesty between us more than almost anything else." They spent the evening speaking of everything and nothing, much as they had during their earliest days together, though now every word carried the particular weight of an ending neither of them wanted to name directly. Alexander spoke of regrets he had never voiced before, ways he wished his life had been shaped differently, choices he wished he had been permitted to make for himself, rather than inheriting them alongside his title. Eleanor spoke of dreams she had carried since childhood, of the life she had once imagined for herself before ever meeting him, and how thoroughly that imagined life had been reshaped by the months they had spent together, for better and for worse. "I do not regret any of it," she told him, as the fire burned low and the candles guttered softly in the quiet room. "Whatever comes next, I do not regret the storm that broke my carriage wheel, or the 3 days that followed, or any letter or meeting since. I only wish the ending were different." "As do I," Alexander said, reaching for her hand across the small space between them. "If I could rewrite the circumstances of my birth, the expectations placed upon me, before I ever had a voice to object, I would do so gladly, if it meant a different future for us. But you cannot." "No, I cannot." His fingers tightened around hers. "But I can give you tonight, freely and completely, without the shadow of anyone else's expectations standing between us. If this is truly to be our farewell, I would rather it be one built from honesty and tenderness than from bitterness and regret." Eleanor understood, in that moment, exactly what he was offering, and she understood too the risk inherent in accepting it, the way it might complicate an already impossible situation further still. But sitting there in the firelight, feeling the full weight of everything they were about to lose pressing down upon her, she found she could not bring herself to refuse him, nor did she particularly want to. "Then let it be honest," she said quietly. "Let it be ours, entirely, before the world takes the rest." What passed between them that night was tender and unhurried, a quiet culmination of months of longing and restraint, conducted with a gentleness that spoke more clearly than any words could have of feelings neither of them had ever managed to fully express aloud. There was sorrow woven through it, an awareness that this closeness could not last beyond the candles burning down to nothing, but there was also something profoundly true in it, a connection that neither duty nor distance nor the coming autumn wedding could fully erase, however hard the world might try. Morning came too quickly, gray light creeping through the small windows of the cottage, and with it came the return of everything they had set aside for one evening, the reality of an announcement soon to be made, a wedding soon to be planned, a distance between their two worlds that no amount of tenderness could permanently bridge. Eleanor dressed in silence, aware of Alexander watching her from the bed, his expression carrying a sorrow he made no attempt to hide. "What happens now?" she finally asked, not quite able to look at him as she spoke. "I do not know," he admitted. "I only know that I will carry this night with me for the rest of my life, whatever else happens." "That is not an answer, Alexander." "No," he said quietly. "It is not. I wish I had a better one to give you." Eleanor finished dressing and stood by the door of the small cottage, looking back at him one final time, memorizing the particular way the morning light fell across his face, wanting to hold on to this image of him before the world reclaimed them both and returned them to their separate, unequal lives. "Goodbye, Alexander," she said softly. He rose from the bed, crossing the room to stand before her, and for a moment she thought he might ask her to stay, might finally say the words that would upend everything his mother and Lady Cordelia's family had arranged. Instead, he simply took her face gently in his hands and kissed her forehead, a tender, aching gesture that felt more final than any words could have managed. "Goodbye, Eleanor," he whispered. "I am sorry it has come to this." She walked away from the cottage that morning without looking back, though every part of her wanted to, and by the time she reached the road that would carry her home, tears had finally begun to fall, unstoppable now that there was no one left to see them. She did not yet know that the previous evening had left her with far more than memories to carry forward, a truth that would soon reshape every plan she had ever made for her future, and force upon her a choice more difficult than any she had faced before. 6 weeks passed before Eleanor began to suspect that something had changed within her body, small signs at first that she dismissed as the natural consequence of grief and sleeplessness, the exhaustion of a heart still recovering from a loss she had not yet learned how to carry. But as the weeks continued and the signs did not fade, a different, far more urgent possibility began to take shape in her mind, one she found herself avoiding for as long as she reasonably could, terrified of what confirming it would mean. She finally sought out a midwife 2 towns over, a woman unfamiliar with her family and therefore unlikely to carry gossip back to anyone who might recognize her name. The midwife was kind but plain-spoken, asking questions Eleanor answered as honestly as her fear allowed, and by the end of the examination, there was no longer any room for doubt. "You are with child," the midwife told her. "Some months along already by my reckoning. Is there a husband, or someone who intends to become one?" Eleanor's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have, and the midwife's expression softened with a sympathy that felt, in that moment, almost harder to bear than judgment would have been. "There are women who help in situations such as this," the midwife said carefully, "if you wish to discuss your options." "No," Eleanor said quickly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "No, I intend to keep this child. I only need to understand what is ahead of me." The midwife explained what she could, the general course of a pregnancy, the approximate timing of the birth, practical matters that gave Eleanor something concrete to hold on to amid the chaos churning through her mind. But none of it addressed the far more immediate and terrifying question that consumed every waking hour from that day forward. What was she to do now, carrying inside her the child of a duke who was, by this point, likely already married to another woman entirely, a woman who knew nothing of Eleanor's existence, and would certainly not welcome the news that her new husband had fathered a child outside their union. Eleanor walked home from that appointment, turning the possibilities over in her mind, each one more frightening than the last. She could write to Alexander, tell him the truth, and trust him to find some way of providing for the child, without destroying either of their lives in the process. But even as she considered it, she understood how impossible that path truly was. A duke's illegitimate child, born to a merchant's daughter, discovered mere months into his marriage to Lady Cordelia, would be a scandal of the kind that destroyed families entirely, ruining not only Alexander's reputation, but Eleanor's as well, and casting a shadow over an innocent child before it had even drawn its first breath. Lady Cordelia would be humiliated. The alliance between the two families, so carefully constructed, would likely collapse, and Eleanor herself would be branded, publicly and permanently, as the woman who had seduced a duke away from his marriage, regardless of the truth of how their relationship had actually unfolded. She could also say nothing at all, disappear quietly, and raise the child alone, sparing everyone the scandal, at the cost of bearing the entire burden herself, in secret, for the rest of her life. This option terrified her in different ways, the loneliness of it, the practical difficulties of raising a child without a husband or a title to shield her from the judgment of a world that showed little mercy to unmarried mothers. But it was, she began to understand over the following days, the only option that did not risk destroying more lives than her own. The first person she had to face with this decision was her own mother, and Eleanor dreaded that conversation more than almost anything she had ever faced. She waited nearly a month, gathering the courage she needed, before finally sitting her mother down one evening, after her father had retired for the night, and telling her, plainly and without excuse, the full truth of what had happened, and what it now meant for her future. Her mother's reaction moved through several stages in the span of a single conversation, shock giving way to anger, anger giving way eventually to a kind of exhausted grief that Eleanor found almost harder to witness than fury would have been. "You have ruined yourself," her mother said at one point, though there was more sorrow in the words than condemnation. "Do you understand what this means? No respectable man will have you now. You will be an outcast, and the child along with you." "I understand," Eleanor said quietly. "I have thought of little else these past weeks." "Does he know?" "No." "Will you tell him?" Eleanor had asked herself this question 100 times over, and she gave her mother the same answer she had settled on after long, sleepless nights of consideration. "I do not think I can. He is married now, or very nearly so. Telling him would destroy far more than just my own life, and I am not certain the child and I would even benefit from it in the end. He might provide for us in secret, but we would always be a secret, hidden away, a shameful truth he had to manage, rather than a family he was permitted to claim. I would rather raise this child on my own terms than live as someone's carefully concealed mistake." Her mother was quiet for a long time after that, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had softened considerably. "Then you will need to leave this place, Eleanor. You cannot stay here, where everyone knows your name and will soon enough notice your condition. The gossip alone would ruin your father's business, and your sister's prospects along with it." The reality of that statement landed heavily, a truth Eleanor had already begun to suspect, but had not yet allowed herself to fully confront. Staying meant not only her own ruin, but the ruin of her entire family, dragged down by association with a scandal not of their making. Leaving meant starting over entirely, alone, in some place where no one knew her name or her circumstances, where she could construct a new identity and a new life for herself and the child she carried. "Where would I go?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Her mother considered this for a long moment. "I have a distant cousin in a town far to the north, a widow who runs a small shop and has written to me before about needing help. She does not know our family well, and she would not think to question a story about a young widow seeking a fresh start after losing her husband. It would not be an easy life, Eleanor, but it would be a safe one, and a respectable one, as far as anyone there would know." Eleanor spent the following weeks in a strange, suspended state, preparing quietly for a departure that would sever her from everything and everyone she had ever known, all while carrying inside her a secret that grew more physically apparent with each passing day. She avoided the parts of town where gossip traveled fastest, kept to the house as much as she reasonably could without raising suspicion, and spent long hours composing, in her mind, the letter she knew she eventually needed to send to Alexander, one final piece of correspondence before she disappeared from his life entirely. She struggled for days over how much truth that letter should contain. Every instinct told her that revealing her condition would only complicate matters further, drawing him into a decision he could not make without destroying his marriage, his family's alliance, and quite possibly his own standing within society. She thought of writing nothing at all, simply vanishing without explanation, but something in her could not bear the thought of him wondering forever what had become of her, imagining perhaps that she had simply grown tired of their connection, or found someone else to occupy her heart. In the end, she settled on a letter that was honest in its feeling, but silent on the matter of the child. A letter that would allow him to grieve the ending of what they had shared, without burdening him with a truth that could only cause more harm than good, for all three of them. Before she could send it, however, news reached her that made the entire situation feel suddenly more urgent than she had anticipated. The Alexander's wedding to Lady Cordelia had taken place 2 weeks earlier, a grand affair attended by half the nobility in the region, and reports of the ceremony had already begun circulating even in Eleanor's quieter corner of the world, carried by traveling merchants and gossiping shopkeepers, who had no idea how deeply their idle chatter would wound the woman overhearing it. Eleanor sat with this news for a long while, feeling something inside her settle into a kind of finality she had been avoiding until that moment. Whatever hope had lingered, however faint, that circumstances might somehow shift in her favor, was now entirely extinguished. Alexander belonged to another woman, publicly and permanently, and the child growing within Eleanor belonged to a man who no longer had any claim to make on his own heart, let alone room in his life for a secret he did not even know existed. She finished her packing that same week, gathering the few belongings she intended to carry with her on the long journey north, and on her final evening in the only home she had ever known, she sat down and wrote the letter she had been composing in her mind for so many days. It was brief, deliberately so, giving her only enough room to say what needed saying, without risking the temptation to reveal more than she had decided was wise. She did not mention the wedding, though she knew he must be aware she had likely heard of it by now, She did not mention the child. She wrote only of gratitude for the time they had shared, of hope that he would find some measure of happiness in the life duty had chosen for him, and of her own intention to begin a new chapter, far from the place where their story had unfolded, a chapter he need not concern himself with, because it belonged entirely to her now, hers alone to carry forward. She sealed the letter carefully, addressed it to the estate she knew he would eventually return to as Lady Cordelia's husband, and arranged for it to be delivered the following morning, after she herself had already departed on the first leg of her journey north, ensuring there would be no opportunity for him to intercept her, no chance for a conversation that might undo the resolve she had fought so hard to build. That night, lying in her childhood bed for the final time, feeling the small, undeniable movement of the child within her, Eleanor allowed herself to weep freely for the life she was leaving behind, for the love she had found and lost within the span of a single unlikely year, and for the uncertain future stretching ahead of her, one she would now face entirely alone, carrying a secret that would shape every decision of her life from that moment forward, and the life of the child, who had not yet even opened its eyes to see the complicated world it was about to inherit. The morning of her departure arrived cold and gray, fitting weather, for a leaving that felt, to Eleanor, like the closing of a door she would never again be permitted to open. Her mother had arranged a seat for her on a merchant's cart heading north, a journey of several days that would carry her far from everything familiar and deposit her, eventually, at the door of a distant cousin she had never met, in a town whose name she had only recently learned to pronounce correctly. Her father, who had said little throughout the weeks since learning the truth, embraced her longer than he ever had before, and though he did not speak of forgiveness or blessing, the tightness of his arms around her communicated something Eleanor chose to accept as both. Her younger sisters cried at the gate, confused by the sudden departure of a sister they had been told was simply traveling to help a relative, unaware of the deeper truth their parents had decided, wisely, to keep from them for their own protection as much as Eleanor's. "Write when you are able," her mother said, pressing a small purse of coins into Eleanor's hands, savings that Eleanor suspected represented a significant portion of whatever her mother had managed to set aside over the years. "Not often, and not with any detail that might be traced back here, but enough that we know you are safe." "I will," Eleanor promised, though even as she said it, she understood how carefully every future letter would need to be worded, how completely she would need to reconstruct herself into someone new, someone whose past bore no traceable connection to the young woman climbing onto that cart. The journey north took 4 days, through countryside that grew steadily less familiar with each passing mile, past towns whose names meant nothing to her, under skies that seemed determined to match her mood, with an almost unrelenting gray. She spent the hours turning over, again and again, the letter she had left behind for Alexander, wondering how he would receive it, whether he would sense the things she had left unspoken, whether some part of him would suspect the truth she had chosen not to share. She arrived at last in the small northern town of her mother's cousin, a place called Marrow Hollow, tucked between low hills and a river that ran gray and cold even in what passed for summer there. The cousin, a widow named Constance who ran a modest shop selling fabric and thread, welcomed Eleanor with a warmth that surprised her, asking few questions beyond what her mother's letter had already explained, that Eleanor was recently widowed and expecting a child, seeking a fresh start away from painful memories. "You may take the name Barrett here, if you like," Constance suggested gently, on Eleanor's first evening in the small rooms above the shop. "No one in Marrow Hollow will know the difference, and it will spare you having to explain a widow's story to a name that does not quite fit the tale." Eleanor accepted the suggestion gratefully, and from that point forward, she became Eleanor Barrett, a young widow who had lost her husband to illness before ever having the chance to properly settle into married life. A story simple enough to be believed without inviting too many follow-up questions. She began helping in Constance's shop within days of arriving, learning the rhythms of a trade quite different from anything she had known before, measuring fabric and matching threads and slowly, gradually, building a life that felt entirely her own, unburdened by the expectations and judgments that had shaped everything before it. The months passed with a strange kind of peace settling over her, disrupted only by the occasional wave of grief that arrived unbidden, usually late at night, when the shop was quiet and there was nothing left to distract her from thoughts of Alexander, of the life she might have had, of the child growing within her who would never know its father's face or name. She wrote to her mother sparingly, as promised, careful letters that revealed little beyond her general well-being, and received similarly cautious replies that assured her the situation at home remained stable, that no whispers of scandal had followed her north, that her sisters continued their lives undisturbed by the truth of what had happened. She thought often, in those quiet months, of writing to Alexander after all, of finally telling him the truth she had chosen to withhold. But each time the impulse arose, she reminded herself of everything such a revelation would risk, not only for him and his new marriage, but for the child itself, who would grow up forever marked as a duke's secret shame, rather than simply a person permitted to exist without the weight of scandal attached to their very existence. She decided, again and again, that silence remained the kinder path, however much it cost her personally to maintain it. The child, a boy, was born on a cold morning in early winter, delivered with the help of the local midwife and Constance, who held Eleanor's hand throughout and wept nearly as much as Eleanor did when the baby finally drew his first breath and filled the small room with his cries. Eleanor named him Jonathan, a name with no connection to Alexander's family or her own former life, a name chosen simply because it felt right, because it belonged entirely to this new chapter she was building, rather than echoing anything from before. Holding Jonathan for the first time, Eleanor felt something shift permanently within her, a fierce and immediate love that eclipsed even the grief she still carried for the life she had lost. Looking down at his small face, she began to see, unmistakably, traces of his father in the shape of his eyes, the particular set of his jaw even as an infant, features that would only grow more pronounced as he aged, features that Eleanor would spend years quietly worrying might one day give away a truth she had worked so hard to bury. "He is beautiful," Constance said, watching Eleanor nurse the baby by the fire that first night. "Whatever brought you here, whatever pain led to this moment, that child is a blessing, and you should not let anyone convince you otherwise." "I do not regret him," Eleanor said softly, meaning it entirely. "I only regret the circumstances that mean he will never know where half of himself comes from. Perhaps that is a kindness, in its own way. Some inheritances are heavier than they are worth." Eleanor considered this for a long time afterward, turning it over during the long nights of feeding and soothing that came with a newborn, and gradually she came to believe there was truth in it. Jonathan would grow up without a title, without land, without the burdens and expectations that came with being a duke's son, but he would also grow up without the weight of scandal, without the cruelty that society reserved for children born outside of marriage when their parentage was known. He would simply be Jonathan Barrett, the son of a widow who ran a fabric shop in a small northern town, free to build whatever life he chose, without the shadow of his true origins hanging over every decision. Life in Marrow Hollow settled into a rhythm over the following years, Eleanor working alongside Constance in the shop while raising Jonathan in the rooms above it, the two of them forming a small, tight-knit family that gave the boy everything he needed even in the absence of a father. Eleanor never remarried, despite occasional interest from men in the town who found the young widow with the sharp mind and gentle manner appealing, always finding some reason to decline their attentions, unable to imagine building a life with anyone else, when a part of her heart remained, stubbornly, attached to a man she would likely never see again. She followed news of Alexander's life from a careful distance, gleaning small details from the occasional traveler who passed through Marrow Hollow with gossip from the south, or from newspapers that occasionally made their way to Constance's shop. She learned, over the years, that his marriage to Lady Cordelia had produced no children of their own, a fact that struck Eleanor with a complicated mixture of sympathy and something she was ashamed to recognize as quiet, private relief. She learned that he had thrown himself increasingly into managing his estate and its tenants, earning a reputation as a fair if somewhat distant landlord, a man who fulfilled his duties without any apparent joy in doing so. She wondered, sometimes, whether he thought of her still, whether the memory of their brief, impossible love lingered in him the way it lingered in her, or whether time and duty had gradually smoothed over the wound until it no longer troubled him at all. She told herself it did not matter either way, that she had made her choice and built her life around it, and that dwelling on questions with no answers served no purpose beyond reopening a grief she had worked hard to manage. Jonathan grew quickly, as children do, developing into a curious and thoughtful boy who showed an early aptitude for numbers and reading that Eleanor made every effort to nurture, scraping together what money she could, to ensure he received whatever education Marrow Hollow's small school could offer, and supplementing it herself with books borrowed from Constance's small but well-loved collection. By the time he reached his 10th year, Jonathan had begun to ask questions about his father, questions Eleanor had long anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. "What was he like?" Jonathan asked one evening, as Eleanor tucked him into bed in the small room they shared above the shop. "He was a good man," Eleanor said carefully, having rehearsed some version of this answer many times over the years without ever quite settling on the perfect way to deliver it. "He died before you were born, from an illness that took him quickly. I do not have much more to tell you, I am afraid. It still pains me to speak of him." Jonathan, sensitive even at his young age to his mother's evident sorrow, did not press further, accepting the vague answer with the easy trust of a child who had no reason to doubt his mother's word. But Eleanor knew, even as she offered the comforting fiction, that the questions would only grow more pointed as he aged, that eventually the story she had constructed would need to hold up against a curiosity that would not remain satisfied forever with such thin explanations. She did not yet know how soon that reckoning would arrive, nor from what unexpected direction it would come, carrying with it consequences that would ripple outward to touch not only her own carefully rebuilt life, but the lives of everyone connected to the secret she had guarded so fiercely for over a decade, a secret that fate, it seemed, was not content to let remain buried forever. By the time Jonathan turned 15, he had grown into a young man whose resemblance to his true father had become impossible for Eleanor to ignore, though she comforted herself with the knowledge that no one in Marrow Hollow had ever laid eyes on Alexander, and therefore had no basis for comparison. He carried himself with an easy confidence that reminded her, painfully and constantly, of the man she had met beside those iron gates so many years before. And his mind showed the same quick, curious intelligence that had first drawn her to Alexander during those long conversations in his library. Jonathan had proven himself an exceptional student, far beyond anything Marrow Hollow's modest school could continue to offer him, and Constance, now well into her later years but still sharp of mind, had begun urging Eleanor to consider sending him further afield for his education, perhaps to a proper academy in one of the larger cities, where his obvious talents might be given room to develop as they deserved. "We cannot afford such a thing," Eleanor said, though the objection felt hollow, even as she voiced it, because some part of her had already begun quietly setting aside whatever small sums she could manage, dreaming of exactly the possibility Constance was now suggesting aloud. "There are scholarships available for boys who show promise," Constance said. "I have heard of them through customers who have sons at such places. It would cost something, certainly, but perhaps not so much as you fear, and the investment would be well worth it for a boy like Jonathan." Eleanor spent the following months making careful inquiries, writing letters to academies in cities she had never visited, describing Jonathan's academic achievements in the hope of securing some measure of financial assistance that would make such an education possible. It was slow, uncertain work, met with more rejections than encouragement, but Eleanor persisted, driven by a fierce determination that her son would have opportunities she herself had never been permitted, regardless of the secret that shadowed his true parentage. Meanwhile, in a life entirely separate from the quiet rhythms of Marrow Hollow, Alexander had settled into an existence defined by duty fulfilled without joy, a marriage to Lady Cordelia that had, over the years, calcified into a courteous but distant arrangement, two people sharing a household and a title, while sharing very little else of themselves. Cordelia, for her part, seemed content enough with the arrangement, occupying herself with the social obligations expected of a duchess, hosting gatherings and managing charitable causes with an efficiency that earned her respect throughout the county, even as the marriage itself remained, in every meaningful sense, empty. Alexander had never spoken of Eleanor to anyone, not to his mother, not to Cordelia, not even to the few close friends who occasionally pressed him, gently, about the melancholy that seemed to follow him through the years, despite his outward success in managing the estate. He carried the memory of her privately, a wound that had never fully healed, resurfacing most sharply on quiet evenings, when the house grew still, and he found himself thinking, against his own better judgment, about a woman who had vanished from his life, over a decade earlier, without any explanation beyond a brief, careful letter that had told him almost nothing at all. He had made inquiries, in the years immediately following her disappearance, discreet attempts to learn where she had gone, and whether she was safe. But Eleanor's family had proven remarkably tight-lipped, offering only vague assurances that she had traveled to stay with distant relatives and preferred not to maintain contact with anyone from her former life. Alexander had eventually accepted, with great reluctance, that pursuing the matter further would only cause her additional distress, and had forced himself, as best he could, to let the question rest, even as it continued to surface unbidden in his quieter moments. His mother, the old Duchess, had passed away 5 years into his marriage, and with her passing, much of the rigid pressure that had once governed his choices had softened considerably. He sometimes wondered, in the years that followed, whether things might have unfolded differently had she died sooner, whether he might have found some way to defy convention and pursue Eleanor properly, rather than allowing duty to dictate the shape of his entire life. But such wondering accomplished nothing beyond deepening his own quiet grief, and he had learned, over time, to set the thoughts aside as best he could, focusing instead on the responsibilities that remained his to manage. It was during a routine visit to a neighboring county, undertaken to inspect a parcel of land his family had recently acquired through a distant relative's estate, that Alexander first found himself, quite by accident, passing through the outskirts of a town he had never before had reason to visit, a place called Marrow Hollow, known locally for little beyond a modest market and a handful of small shops catering to the surrounding farms. He had stopped only because his carriage required fresh horses, and while waiting at the local inn for the exchange to be arranged, he found himself wandering the small main street, drawn by nothing more than idle curiosity and the desire to stretch his legs after a long morning of travel. It was there, passing a modest fabric shop with a faded sign reading Barrett's, that he happened to glance through the window and see a young man inside, perhaps 16 or 17 years of age, helping a customer select a length of cloth with the same easy, thoughtful manner Alexander recognized, with a jolt that stopped him entirely in his tracks, as unmistakably, impossibly familiar. Alexander stood frozen on the street for a long moment, staring through the glass at a face that seemed to be looking back at him across the years, the particular set of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, features that echoed his own reflection so closely that he felt, for a moment, as though he were looking at some strange vision of his own youth, rather than a stranger in a shop window. He told himself it had to be coincidence, that resemblance without connection was common enough in the world, that his mind was simply conjuring ghosts from a grief he had never fully released. But something compelled him to enter the shop anyway, some instinct he could not have named even if pressed, and as the bell above the door announced his arrival, the young man looked up, offering the polite, practiced smile of someone accustomed to serving customers, entirely unaware of the storm his simple presence had just unleashed in the mind of the stranger now standing before him. "Good afternoon, sir," the young man said. "How may I help you?" Alexander found himself momentarily unable to speak, studying the boy's face with an intensity that must have seemed strange to an outside observer, searching for some feature that might contradict the resemblance and restore his sense of rational order to the moment. But the longer he looked, the more certain he became, and a cold, dizzying realization began settling over him, one that reshaped, in an instant, every assumption he had carried about the last 16 years of his life. "Forgive me," Alexander finally managed. "I only require a moment. Is your mother available, by any chance?" "She is in the back, sir." "Shall I fetch her for you?" Before Alexander could answer, a woman's voice called from behind the curtain separating the front of the shop from the workroom beyond, asking who had come in, and a moment later, Eleanor stepped through the curtain, wiping her hands on her apron, her attention still partly occupied by whatever task she had been engaged in moments before. She looked up, and the moment her eyes met Alexander's across the small shop, every ounce of color drained from her face, and the length of fabric she had been carrying slipped from her hands, falling forgotten to the floor between them. "Alexander," she whispered, the name escaping her before she could stop it, and beside her, Jonathan looked between his mother and the stranger, with obvious confusion, sensing, even without understanding, that something enormous and long buried had just risen to the surface of a quiet afternoon that had begun like any other. Alexander looked from Eleanor's stricken face to the young man standing beside her, and back again, and in that single, suspended moment, 16 years of careful secrecy began, irrevocably, to unravel. For a long moment, no one in the small shop said anything at all. the three of them, frozen in a tableau that seemed to stretch far longer than the few seconds it actually occupied. Jonathan looked between his mother and the stranger, sensing the sudden tension without understanding its source, and finally, uncertain what else to do, he bent to retrieve the fallen fabric from the floor. "Mother," he said quietly, "are you unwell?" Eleanor forced herself to breathe, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "I am fine, Jonathan. This is an old acquaintance, from before you were born. Would you mind minding the front of the shop while I speak with him?" Jonathan, still visibly confused but too well-mannered to press further in front of a stranger, nodded and retreated toward the counter, though his eyes lingered on Alexander with a curiosity that suggested he, too, had noticed something unusual in the resemblance between them, even if he could not yet name what it was. Eleanor led Alexander through the curtain into the small back room where fabric bolts lined the walls, closing the door behind them to ensure privacy from the front of the shop. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the years of separation stretching between them like an uncrossable distance, even as they stood only a few feet apart. "He is mine," Alexander finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, though it was not a question. "Eleanor, tell me the truth. He is my son." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of 16 years of careful silence collapsing around her all at once. "Yes," she said quietly. "Jonathan is your son." Alexander sank onto a nearby stool, as though his legs could no longer fully support the enormity of what he had just heard confirmed. 16 years, he said, his voice thick with an emotion Eleanor could not quite name, something between grief and anger and disbelief all tangled together. "You have kept my son from me for 16 years, and never once thought to tell me the truth?" "I thought I was protecting him," Eleanor said, her own voice rising slightly in response to the accusation beneath his words. "You had already married Lady Cordelia by the time I learned I was carrying him." "What would you have had me do, Alexander? Write to you and shatter your marriage, your family's alliance, everything you had built, all so that Jonathan could grow up as your shameful secret, rather than simply as my son, free to live without the burden of scandal attached to his name? You should have told me, and let me decide what to do with that knowledge, rather than making the decision alone and denying me any say in the matter at all." Alexander's hands were trembling slightly, and he pressed them together, as though trying to steady himself. "I have a son, Eleanor. Do you understand what that means to me? Cordelia and I were never able to have children of our own. I have spent years believing I would have no heir at all, no one to carry forward anything I have built, and all that time, you were raising my son not 2 counties away, and I never knew." The mention of Cordelia's inability to conceive struck Eleanor with an unexpected pang of sympathy, complicating the anger she had been prepared to feel at his accusation. "I did not know that," she said quietly. "I am sorry for whatever pain that has caused you both. But you must understand, Alexander, I made the choice I believed was kindest, for everyone involved, including you. Announcing Jonathan's existence would have destroyed your marriage and likely ruined both our reputations beyond repair. I chose to protect him from that, even at the cost of denying you the knowledge of his existence." "And what of my cost?" Alexander asked, his voice cracking slightly on the words. "What of the years I spent wondering why you left, imagining every possible reason except the truth? What of the loneliness I have carried through a marriage that gave me companionship without ever giving me love, believing all the while that I would leave this world with no child to inherit what I had spent my life building? You made that choice for both of us, Eleanor, and I was never given the chance to weigh in on a decision that shaped the rest of my life as much as it shaped yours." Eleanor felt tears gathering, the accumulated weight of 16 years finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained for so long. "I did what I believed was right, with the information and options available to me at the time. I do not know if it was the correct choice. I have wondered, more nights than I can count, whether I made a terrible mistake in staying silent. But I cannot undo it now, Alexander, any more than you can undo the marriage you made to secure your family's future." They sat in silence for a long moment after that, the anger between them slowly giving way to something more complicated. A shared grief for years lost that neither of them could reclaim, however much they might wish otherwise. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his voice steadier now, though still heavy with emotion. "What happens now?" he asked. "Jonathan is my son, my only child, my heir by blood, if not by any legal recognition. I cannot simply walk away from this shop and pretend I never learned the truth. What are you suggesting? Eleanor asked carefully, a familiar fear rising in her chest, the old worry that had haunted her decision from the very beginning, that acknowledging Jonathan's true parentage would bring scandal crashing down upon all of them regardless of how carefully it was managed. I do not know, entirely, Alexander admitted. But I know that I cannot leave here today and simply continue as though nothing has changed. I want to know my son, Eleanor. I want him to know the truth of where he comes from, even if we must proceed carefully, even if it takes time to determine how much of that truth can be safely made public. Eleanor considered this for a long moment, weighing the fear that had governed her decisions for 16 years, against the reality now standing before her, a man clearly desperate for connection to a son he had only just discovered, a man whose own marriage had left him without an heir of his own blood, a circumstance that suddenly cast their situation in a very different light than the one Eleanor had imagined all those years ago. He does not know, she said finally. I told him his father died of illness before he was born. He has no idea that any of this is true. Then perhaps it is time he learned, Alexander said gently, not necessarily all at once, and not necessarily with all the complications of my title attached immediately. But he deserves to know his father is alive, Eleanor, and I deserve the chance to be part of his life, however that arrangement eventually takes shape. Eleanor nodded slowly, feeling something inside her, some long-held tension, begin to loosen for the first time in years. We will need to speak with him together, she said. He will have questions, and he deserves honest answers, even if we must be careful about who else learns of this beyond our small circle. They returned to the front of the shop together, where Jonathan had been quietly attending to a customer, his expression still carrying traces of the confusion he had felt earlier. When the customer departed, he turned to his mother and the stranger with obvious curiosity, sensing that whatever conversation had occurred behind the curtain had changed something fundamental in the atmosphere of the room. Jonathan, Eleanor said, her voice gentle but steady. There is something your true father and I need to explain to you, and I think it would be best if we spoke somewhere more private. Jonathan's eyes widened slightly at the phrase true father, understanding immediately that whatever was about to be revealed would upend the story he had grown up believing. This is him? He asked, looking at Alexander with an expression caught between wonder and disbelief. This is my father? Yes, Alexander said, stepping forward slightly, his voice carrying a warmth that Eleanor had not heard from him in 16 years. I only learned of your existence a few moments ago, Jonathan, but I promise you, now that I know, I have no intention of disappearing from your life again. The conversation that followed, held in the small back room over the course of the next several hours, was long and difficult and occasionally tearful, as Eleanor and Alexander explained, in careful stages appropriate to Jonathan's age and understanding, the full story of how they had met, how circumstances had separated them, and why Eleanor had made the choices she had made to protect him. Jonathan listened with a maturity beyond his years, asking pointed questions that neither of his parents fully anticipated, but ultimately absorbing the enormous revelation with a resilience that spoke well of the character Eleanor had worked so hard to instill in him. So I am a duke's son, Jonathan said eventually, testing the words as though trying to understand what weight they carried. Does that mean I am to inherit something, or is this simply information I am meant to carry quietly, the way Mother has carried it all these years? Alexander considered the question carefully before answering. That is something we will need to determine together, over time, and with great care. There are legal and social complications to consider, given the circumstances of your birth. But I will tell you plainly, Jonathan, that I intend to acknowledge you as my son, in whatever manner proves possible, and to ensure you have access to opportunities befitting that connection, whatever form those opportunities ultimately take. Over the following months, Alexander made arrangements that would have seemed impossible to Eleanor only a year earlier, working carefully and discreetly with lawyers and trusted advisors to establish Jonathan's parentage in a manner that protected both the boy's reputation and Eleanor's, while also ensuring that Jonathan would have access to an education and future worthy of his true heritage. Lady Cordelia, informed of the situation with as much delicacy as Alexander could manage, responded with a grace that surprised everyone involved, recognizing perhaps that an heir born of scandal was preferable to an estate with no heir at all, and that Jonathan's presence in their lives need not fundamentally threaten the arrangement she and Alexander had built together over the years. however imperfect that arrangement had always been. Eleanor herself was offered a quiet, comfortable settlement that allowed her to relocate closer to the estate, near enough that she could remain a meaningful presence in Jonathan's life, as he transitioned into a world entirely different from the one he had known in Marrow Hollow, while still maintaining enough distance to avoid the kind of scandal that had once seemed inevitable should the truth ever emerge. It was not, in the end, the fairy tale ending that Eleanor might once have imagined during those early days beside the fire in Alexander's library, all those years before. There would be no marriage between them, no undoing of the years lost or the pain endured on both sides. But there was, finally, truth where there had once been secrecy, connection where there had once been distance, and a future for Jonathan that acknowledged fully who he was and where he came from, rather than requiring him to carry the weight of a hidden inheritance for the rest of his days. Standing together in the gardens of the estate some months later, watching Jonathan ride across the grounds with an ease that suggested he had already begun to feel at home in a world so different from the one he had grown up in, Eleanor and Alexander found themselves, for the first time in 16 years, able to simply stand side by side, without the weight of secrets pressing down between them. "I do not know if I made the right choice, all those years ago," Eleanor said quietly, watching her son grow smaller in the distance. "But I know I would make it again, given the same impossible circumstances. I only wish it had not taken 16 years for the truth to finally find its way home." "Perhaps some truths simply need their own time to surface," Alexander replied, his eyes following Jonathan as well. "What matters now is that it has, and that he stands here today knowing exactly who he is, and where he belongs, in both of our lives." They stood together in comfortable silence as the afternoon light stretched long across the grounds, two people forever changed by a storm that had broken a carriage wheel so many years before, and by a truth that had waited patiently, through separation and silence and years of quiet sacrifice. For the moment, it was finally ready to be known. 3 years passed before Jonathan fully settled into the rhythms of his new life, years marked by careful adjustment on every side, as a boy raised above a fabric shop in a quiet northern town, learned to navigate the expectations of an estate, a title, and a family history far larger than anything he had imagined during his childhood in Marrow Hollow. He proved himself, throughout those years, remarkably capable of bridging the two worlds he now belonged to, retaining the humility and groundedness his mother had instilled in him, while gradually absorbing the responsibilities that would one day fall to him as Alexander's acknowledged heir. Eleanor watched this transformation with a complicated mixture of pride and quiet grief, pleased to see her son thriving in circumstances far beyond what she could ever have provided for him alone, yet occasionally mourning the simpler life they had shared together in the rooms above Constance's shop, a life that could never fully return to what it had once been. She had relocated, as arranged, to a comfortable cottage on the edge of Alexander's estate, close enough to remain a constant presence in Jonathan's life, far enough to avoid the kind of daily proximity that might have invited unwanted speculation among the estate's staff and neighboring families. Lady Cordelia, to Eleanor's continued surprise, proved an unexpectedly gracious presence throughout this transition, treating Jonathan with a warmth that suggested genuine affection rather than mere tolerance of an arrangement she had been forced to accept. The two women maintained a careful, respectful distance from one another, never quite becoming friends given the complicated history between them, but developing over time a mutual understanding that Jonathan's well-being mattered more than any lingering resentment either might have privately harbored. Constance, now well into her 70s, wrote regularly from Marrow Hollow, her letters full of news from the shop and gentle inquiries about how Eleanor and Jonathan were adjusting to their changed circumstances. Eleanor visited her whenever possible, grateful for the woman who had taken her in without judgment during the most frightening period of her life, and who had helped raise Jonathan through his early years, with a steadiness Eleanor knew she could never fully repay. Alexander, for his part, found himself transformed by the presence of a son he had spent 16 years not knowing existed. The melancholy that had followed him through his marriage to Cordelia gradually lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose as he worked to teach Jonathan everything required of a future duke, from the management of tenant disputes to the careful diplomacy required in dealing with neighboring estates. Their relationship deepened steadily over those 3 years, moving past the initial awkwardness of strangers suddenly bound by blood, into something that began to resemble, more and more, the natural bond between a father and son who had simply been given a late start. There were difficult conversations still to be had throughout this period, moments when old wounds resurfaced unexpectedly. Jonathan, now approaching adulthood, occasionally struggled with resentment toward the circumstances of his upbringing, wondering aloud to his mother why she had not found some way to tell Alexander the truth sooner, sparing them both years of separation that might otherwise have been avoided. The burrito was cold. "I understand your reasoning, Mother," he told her one evening, during a visit to her cottage that had become a regular occurrence in his busy new schedule, "but I cannot help wondering what my childhood might have looked like, had things been different." "I understand that wondering," Eleanor said gently, "and I do not fault you for it. But I want you to understand something, Jonathan. The childhood you had, whatever it lacked in material comfort, gave you a foundation that I believe has served you well here. You learned the value of hard work, of humility, of understanding people who have little rather than only those who have much. I do not think the boy who grew up in that fabric shop is so different from the young man now learning to manage an estate. I think in many ways, that early foundation is exactly what makes you capable of handling this new life with the grace you have shown." Jonathan considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Perhaps you are right. I only wish there had been another way, one that did not require so much sacrifice on your part." "Every choice carries some cost," Eleanor said. "I chose the cost I believed I could bear, in order to spare you and your father costs I believed would have been far heavier. I do not regret that choice. Even now, even knowing everything that has happened since." As Jonathan approached his 20th year, preparations began in earnest for his formal introduction into society as Alexander's acknowledged heir, a process that required careful management of the story surrounding his birth and upbringing, crafted with the help of Alexander's lawyers to present a version of events that protected everyone's reputation while still allowing for the truth of his parentage to be publicly recognized. The story that eventually circulated described a private arrangement made years earlier between Alexander and a woman of good family whose identity was kept discreetly out of public discussion, a version of events vague enough to avoid scandal, while still establishing Jonathan's legitimate claim to eventually inherit the dukedom. The formal announcement, when it finally came, was met with the kind of curious speculation Eleanor had always feared, whispered conversations at social gatherings, raised eyebrows among the more judgmental corners of society. But time, as it often does, gradually softened the edges of scandal, particularly as Jonathan himself proved, through his conduct and evident capability, that whatever unconventional circumstances had brought him into the world, he was more than equal to the responsibilities now placed upon him. Eleanor found herself, in these later years, settling into a quiet contentment she had not expected to find when she first climbed into that cart, bound for Marrow Hollow so many years before. She never remarried, content instead with the relationship she had rebuilt with Alexander, not romantic in nature any longer, both of them having grown past the possibility of reclaiming what circumstance had denied them in their youth, but warm and respectful nonetheless, bound together permanently by the son they had created and the years of separation they had both, in their own ways, survived. On the day of Jonathan's official coming-of-age celebration, a grand affair held at the estate that Eleanor attended as an honored guest rather than a hidden secret for the first time in her life, she stood at the edge of the gathering, watching her son move confidently among the assembled guests, greeting tenants and nobility alike with the same easy warmth that had first drawn Alexander to notice him in that small fabric shop years before. Alexander found her there, standing slightly apart from the celebration, and came to stand beside her, both of them watching Jonathan with the quiet pride of parents who had traveled an impossibly difficult road to reach this particular moment. "We did well in the end," Alexander said softly, "despite everything that stood between us along the way." "We did," Eleanor agreed, feeling for the first time in over 16 years, something that felt genuinely close to peace. "Whatever else was lost, whatever pain we both carried through those years apart, I believe we managed to give him something worth having, in the end." "A good foundation," Alexander said, echoing the words Eleanor had once offered Jonathan himself. "Yes," Eleanor said, smiling as she watched her son laugh at something a young woman near him had said, his face bright with the kind of easy happiness she had worked so hard, for so many years, to make possible. "A good foundation, built from love, however complicated its beginnings, and strong enough, I hope, to carry him through whatever the future holds." As the celebration continued around them, Music and laughter filling the gardens where Eleanor had once walked as a frightened young mother carrying an impossible secret. She allowed herself, finally, to release the last remnants of guilt and fear that had shadowed her for so many years. The storm that had broken her carriage wheel all those years ago had set in motion a chain of events far more complicated and painful than she could ever have anticipated on that rain-soaked evening. But standing here now, watching the son born of that unlikely beginning step confidently into the life awaiting him, Eleanor understood, with a clarity that settled deep and permanent within her, that every difficult choice, every sacrifice, every year of careful silence had ultimately led to exactly the outcome she had always hoped for, even in her darkest moments of doubt. A son who knew, finally and completely, exactly who he was, and a family, however unconventional its shape, bound together at last by truth rather than secrecy, by acknowledgement rather than shame, and by a love that had, against every obstacle placed in its path, endured.